Once again, we are seeing Justin Trudeau's attempt to silence people as they try to talk about things that are happening. I know that the Prime Minister's office and the Minister of Global Affairs office have both denied that this happened. They said that it didn't come from their office, but we've seen these denials before.
The federal government is facing allegations of inappropriate political interference after two former ambassadors to China confirmed that Global Affairs Canada called them about public comments they were making about the dispute with China. An assistant deputy minister allegedly told the former ambassadors the government would like to speak with one voice on the issue. Is this political interference? Joining me now to discuss from Toronto, Rob Oliphant is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In Durham, Ontario, Aaron O'Toole is the Conservatives' Foreign Affairs critic. And in Rimouski, Quebec, Guy Caron is the NDP's Foreign Affairs critic. Hi to all three of you. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Hi, Vash.
Mr. Oliphant, I'll start with you. Did someone working for the government invoke the Prime Minister's office and tell former Ambassador to China, David Mulroney, to speak with one voice on China in reference not only to the diplomatic dispute with that country, but also the upcoming election in this country?
Obviously, I wasn't privy to a conversation between an official and former diplomat. What I have been absolutely told with complete clarity is there was no direction, there was no influence, and there was no engagement from either the Prime Minister's office or the Foreign Affairs Minister's office to try to muzzle a former diplomat, and nor to direct an official to try to do that. And before I got on this show, I actually pinned them down and said, I don't want to go on a television show to talk about this until I'm absolutely confident, absolutely certain, and have been told very clearly that there was absolutely no inappropriate behavior, and there was no activity that could even be engaged as such. And I don't know.
Just to be clear, no inappropriate behavior on the part of this individual or of the government? Because are you saying that he was not
on part of the government? The official, I don't know what was said. It would be, and I would absolutely say it would be absolutely inappropriate for an assistant deputy minister to make any kind of comments, either attributing to the Prime Minister's office or to an official, an elected person, and that would be totally inappropriate. And I can't speak for that because I wasn't in on that conversation. All I can be absolutely clear about is that the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, the Minister, and the Minister's office was not involved in this.
So just to be clear, there is no directive or no ask from the federal government of former ambassadors or diplomats of any sort to speak with, quote unquote, one voice?
Absolutely not. Do I actually think that Canada is more effective if we speak with one voice? Yes, I would be very clear about saying that. I'd be very clear about saying that we will take advice from all parties, from former diplomats, from current diplomats, from academics, from business leaders, from university presidents, even from the Conservatives and the NDP if they have something constructive to offer about this relationship with China. But at the same time, we would never attempt to direct an official to tell them to do something that was political.
Mr. O'Toole, is it possible that this person acted essentially out of turn if the government's overarching intent is to kind of help inform former diplomats and academics of what they know, what they're doing, and solicit their advice to a certain extent? Isn't that a good thing?
No, because I don't believe the government, Vashi. It reminds me of how the PMO and the Prime Minister himself said there was no pressure applied on Ms. Wilson-Raybould in the SNC affair. And we saw that that line was proven false many, many times. And we've seen this before. In fact, you remember on the Prime Minister's disastrous trip to India, when there was some criticism coming out in the media for it, they sent out Daniel Jean, the National Security Advisor, to run spin against media criticism of their foreign policy actions. So this is almost the same situation where two former ambassadors, not partisan at all, very prominent citizens, who steadily have provided some criticisms, some advice. The government has ignored that advice. They've ignored advice from experts, from the Conservatives for over 7 months. The Prime Minister's been failing on China, and everyone knows that. Now they're trying to say, you can't speak up, you can't speak out, you can't criticize them. And this whole one voice narrative, they're failing. So,
but how do you know it's not true? How do you know that this individual didn't act, perhaps, like, isn't it possible that they were invoking the Prime Minister's office without the explicit direction of the Prime Minister's office?
I think after the SNC Lavalin affair, Vashi, nobody believes the Prime Minister's office. We also know Mr. Butts is back there. And to me, following Foreign Affairs, following the India case where they had the National Security Advisor, who usually speaks to nobody, pushed out to do media and damage control on the India trip. This has been a habit of this government, certainly not the clear and transparent and sunny ways government people thought it was going to be 4 years ago. So I would like to hear from more people, because if they went and told 2 former ambassadors this, did they go to university campuses? Did they go to other prominent voices and try and silence them? This should really trouble Canadians on the eve of an election.
Mr. Caron, what do you think? I mean, Mr. Oliphant says he's confident that this didn't come from the Prime Minister's office. On background, officials have from the Prime Minister's office and the and GAC have both said the same thing. Do you have a reason not to believe them?
I do, actually. This is not coming from a rookie public servant. It's coming from an assistant deputy minister who knows better. And, you know, when that assistant deputy minister in the conversation brings the fact that we have to speak with one voice, but we have to do it given electoral concerns or the sensitive electoral context, that's really a problem. And it shows to me that it's not coming from public service, it's coming from the Prime Minister's office. An assistant deputy minister's role is to actually manage the situation, not on behalf of a political party, not on behalf of the Liberal Party, but on behalf of the government, and to make that call, to ask someone to restrain their freedom of speech, despite the fact that they do have an expertise in the field, is not something that they would be undertaken without a political direction to do so.
Mr. Oliphant, let me ask you, my understanding is, at least what I've been told from people on the government side, is that there is sort of an overarching desire to talk to diplomats and academics, again, like you said, to solicit their opinions. I take Mr. O'Toole's point that there is a perception that that advice is not being followed at all as well. But has there ever been any attempt as part of that strategy to reach out to John McCallum or Jean Chrétien and talk to them about what they've been saying about Canada's relationship with China?
Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, is talking to everyone, talking to diplomats, former diplomats, opinion leaders, academics. That's what we do. And frankly, I need to address some of the comments that have been made by Mr. O'Toole.
I'll give you a second to do that, but before you do that, have they reached out to John McCallum and Jean Chrétien? Not all in general.
I wouldn't know. They have reached out to countless numbers of people. The minister's working on this, and I find it absolutely no less than despicable that Erin O'Toole would make this a political issue. We have lives in the balance in this issue. This is something that has absolutely seized our government. I went to China. The Conservatives didn't go to China. We have been engaged in this all the way through, absolutely critically, thoughtfully, carefully, diplomatically, and appropriately. And for them to try to make political hay, what they did recently was they put out a YouTube video talking about this issue that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver's family had to actually ask them to edit, and they did edit it because they're trying to make political hay out of something that is absolutely despicable.
I take your point on the video and the ad, but are they not entitled as the opposition
Mr. O'Toole admit that
to ask your question? I will ask him in a second. Just give me a moment. Are they not entitled to ask questions about the policy that your government has pursued with respect to China?
Absolutely. They can ask them. But what we're saying is this is beyond politics. This is about lifting up the lives of Canadians and the livelihoods of Canadian farmers. It's about lifting them up and saying this is beyond politics. This is something that we should be doing in a united way. They can be critical of us. That is their responsibility as opposition members. However, when they attempt to paint something in completely inappropriate terms with no evidence, just casting aspersions and casting accusations with absolutely no authority or credibility, then we draw the line.
Mr. O'Toole,
we draw the line and we say lives are at stake and livelihoods are in the risk.
And he's referencing, Mr. Oliphant is referencing Mr. O'Toole, an ad that your party put out that was critical of Justin Trudeau's approach to this issue, and specifically the 2 Canadians who are detained, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver. It showed their pictures. Your party heard from someone in the family and then removed the ad. And so, you know, is the point that you're trying to overly politicize this one that the government is rightfully making?
No, it was appropriate for us to edit the ad. We are going to be holding the Trudeau government to account for their failures on the foreign policy front. In fact, Canada's never been so alone. That's what a former Liberal deputy prime minister has said. Rob and the Liberals have failed on this for 7 months, Bashi. In fact, you remember how they mocked us last December when we said the Prime Minister will need to personally intervene here because it wasn't a regular consular case. The 2 Michaels were detained as a tit-for-tat diplomatic response. And the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland failed to reach out. They failed to manage expectations with respect to the arrest. And we asked them to intervene quickly because we knew this could go very poorly for our citizens and for billions in exports. They failed, and they actually haven't even listened to our voice or to voices like Mr. Saint-Jacques, Mr. Mulroney, who've made specific references on sending a special envoy, getting talks reestablished. They've ignored everyone, and now that there's criticism, they're saying you can't criticize us. We should be one voice.
Is there a
well, your
point?
voice is failing, Rob.
Is there a point, though, if the criticism, if it is considered too political, that it could, that China could seize on that?
No, obviously. Remember, Vashi, John McCallum, former senior minister of this government, former ambassador, was in China asking them to help the Liberal Party a few weeks ago. So if they're calling former diplomats and asking them to run their comments by the PMO, what are they doing with Jean Chrétien, John McCallum? John McCallum said to China, don't criticize Canada or you'll help the Conservatives, almost inviting foreign intervention.
Minister Freeland, to be fair, did condemn those comments.
After the fact. Around the same time he was there, we had a Liberal minister, Minister Ng, selling ice cream and acting like everything was going well in Beijing. It was embarrassing, quite frankly. So I think the government needs to do a reset. We've said we would actually work on a bipartisan level with them, with prominent Canadians like the ambassadors they're now trying to silence. We all want to see Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver returned home. Okay. And then our export access opened up. And if Conservatives can work with them now, or if we can solve it when we form government in the fall, that's going to be a priority.
Last word to you, Mr. Caron.
Yeah, I respect Rob, and I know that he wasn't privy to the conversation, but someone is lying here. I don't believe it's the journalist who came out with the story. I don't believe that it's Mr. Mulroney. I don't believe that it's the Assistant Deputy Minister. You don't call and saying that you're directed to call by the Prime Minister's office without that being the case, especially from an experienced public servant. So all fingers are pointing right now to the Prime Minister's office that tried to restrict the freedom of speech of a former official, a former diplomatic official who's got knowledge on the situation. We're talking about a former diplomat, Canadian ambassador to China. And I would say before worrying about what former ambassadors are saying, I would start thinking about finally appointing a permanent Canadian ambassador to China to actually help with this situation.
Okay, I got to leave it there. I'm out of time. I apologize. Thank you very much to all three of you, though. Thanks to Rob Oliphant, Aaron O'Toole, and Guy Caron.
And I think it's atrocious that the Prime Minister's office feels that they can intervene and interfere in this way. I know that the Prime Minister's office and the Minister of Global Affairs office have both denied that this happened. They said that it didn't come from their office, but we've seen these denials before. And in fact, we endured an entire spring of having bits and pieces of information come out over and over again about exactly how deep the Prime Minister, his office, his former and now back again advisor, Gerald Butts, in terms of giving information, in terms of covering up issues, and in terms of trying to silence people as they want to tell the truth.
The federal government is facing allegations of inappropriate political interference after two former ambassadors to China confirmed that Global Affairs Canada called them about public comments they were making about the dispute with China. You just heard Conservative MP Lisa Raitt linking these new allegations to the SNC-Lavalin affair in the spring, calling it a pattern of political interference by the Prime Minister's office. So is that a fair conclusion? And will the public make the same links between those issues? Time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Managing Director of Macmillan Vantage, Tim Murphy, Melissa Lantzman of Hale & Knowlton Strategies, and Andrew Thompson, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister, now Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto, join us also from Toronto. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Tim, I'm going to start with you. So we just had a panel of MPs on, including Rob Oliphant, who's one of the Parliamentary Secretaries to Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, and he really insists that this was not the direction of the Prime Minister's office, that even though the Prime Minister's office was invoked in this conversation, that it was not condoned, that didn't come from them. The opposition members that we had on, Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Caron, did not bite at that. What do you think?
Well, we're less than 100 days away from an election, so the temperatures start rising, and I saw that panel got a little heated. It's kind of what you expect in the political gamesmanship running up to an election. I would say it's, it was a bit odd that if you were doing this from the government perspective, you know, in other words, from the Liberal government's perspective and wanting to have a unified voice, it's a bit odd to send out an assistant deputy minister to do it, to have a conversation. I've worked with David when he was in government, and frankly, he wouldn't even do what you told him when he was in government, and you paid him. So I you know, it's kind of, you know, anyone who knows David knows he is an independent thinker. That's one of his great strengths. So the notion somehow that, and I know the government, and Minister Freeland would know these players intimately. She's been intimately involved in the file. It just seems like an odd thing for the government to have done and for the PMO to do this. I can see, you know, the government wanting to say, look, we're trying to, you know, please check in before you make public comments because we're at a sensitive point. And we all well know that, you know, China may not have quite the same understanding of the toing and froing of our political, operations as they do there. And so I could easily see a government saying, look, just before you say some things, we're at a critical point and check in kind of thing. I think this is, you know, to use the Shakespearean quote, it's full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing.
The interesting thing is it kind of picks up on something that we've heard the opposition, Andrew, talk about before, or sorry, the government talk about before, and that is sort of drawing concern or a spotlight to what they are calling or characterizing as an over-politicization. And you heard Mr. Oliphant talk about that in the previous panel as well, that this idea of one voice is out of concern for the two individuals who are detained in China and the way in which China might perceive cleavages in the way Canadians are acting. What do you think of that argument?
I think it's difficult anytime a government puts forward an argument that says, don't question us, don't ask about what's up, and whatever you do, stick to the line that we've developed. I think that does not leave for a very good, sound basis to move forward with policy, and I think that's one of the problems that's happened here. Is one of the reasons we're seeing former ambassadors and deputies and others freelancing on this issue is because they've not been effectively drawn into the conversation to try and help solve the problem. If the government was really wanting to deal with this constructively, they would be using their best minds and the best powers available to them to figure out how to fix it. Instead, what we seem to have now is a fractionalized, largely political response being driven by each of the parties. Is that ultimately helpful? Probably not. Is it inevitable? 100 days out, likely.
What the interesting part also to me, Melissa, is that and we got to it a bit in the panel, is that David Mulroney and Guy Saint-Jacques, while initially a bit critical of the government's response, have not been lately. And I was saying last night, I've had them on the show often, and in fact, they usually say, yeah, Chrystia Freeland said the right thing here. Canada is doing the right thing here. We really need to rely on the U.S., things like that. So there are other people who have made it a bit harder for the government, namely John McCallum and Jean Chrétien.
Well, there is a difference between, and we went from on the panel to saying the Prime Minister's office didn't do this to maybe the Prime Minister's office, according to Tim, would have liked to check in or direct the conversation a little bit.
Yeah,
so there's a bit of
what I said.
There's a bit of a different story.
He said that and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. He basically said that if they were asking to check in because of how serious the sort of effect.
And there's a difference between a government being on the same page, which I agree is important in frankly in all cases on all policies. When we speak about foreign affairs, we should speak with one Canadian unified voice. But there's a difference between silencing critic and it becoming a pattern now. And the opposition drew that pattern to what we saw earlier in a silencing of Judy Wilson-Raybould, a potential silencing of Mark Norman, and when something becomes a pattern, Canadians start to question whether this is a government that said that they were going to do things differently, or frankly not.
Tim, what do you think of that? Do you think, and this is sort of the question we posed off the offset, the opposition is saying this is indicative of other behavior of this government. Do you think that will resonate with people, that it sort of taints the idea that this government wasn't going to act in that way? I'm not saying it's happening or it's not, but just the perception.
Yeah, and I understand the tactics of the opposition. I think the reality is different than the view the opposition is advancing. I think, at the end of the day, I think this is an issue where fundamentally what Canadians want is, the two detained people brought home and kind of a return to a more normal relationship, at least what we'd hope would be a more normal relationship with China. They understand it's complicated, it's difficult. China is a significantly changed player on the global network, and I think they view it as a complicated and challenging file, and I think they'll understand a government trying to, feel its way through it. At the end of the day, look, there are going to be differences of opinion what the best thing for. David has been occasionally critical of the government, occasionally complimentary. this notion of the government trying to kind of, shut dissent is something I think the Conservatives use for their base, but is not widely viewed outside that.
Although the Globe and Mail's report certainly doesn't help things. I mean,
the Globe's on this, and it likes.
But they didn't embellish. I mean, the government didn't deny anything they reported. In this instance.
Well, no, it said it had nothing. They'd never had those conversations. It denied that completely.
No, it
Absolutely
didn't. No, sorry, the government didn't deny that the ADM, that the Assistant Deputy Minister had those conversations with the two.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
no, they just denied that it was on their direction.
He did. I don't know, but they certainly denied they told him to do it.
Yes, that's.
I think one of the other questions that pops up here that people are going to start to ask is, why does government feel like they can, in fact, do this? Whether it's on SNC or whether it's on the Admiral Norman affair. Why do they think that they can, in fact, go and intervene in these issues? Or with John McCallum? And I think what keeps coming back to is that there's just far too cozy a relationship between some of the political decision makers and some of the corporate ones. And we've certainly seen that in SNC Lavalin. And we've certainly seen that or believe that's what we're seeing in the Admiral Norman affair, although we've not had any kind of full hearing of that. It's this coziness that I think is really causing a question. And when you get a fracture like we've had now on China, where that starts to fall apart, I think you start to see, the teeth get bared.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.